Okay, let's try and unpack this. Next, Technology Holding Inc., ticker NXTT. It just had this absolutely wild ride.
Yeah, wild is putting it mildly.
I mean, we're talking a stock that shot up over 660% in, like,
Right.
one day, and then a lot of action after hours, too. It just makes you think, what is really going on under the surface here?
It definitely does. You see moves like that, and you know there's got to be more to it than just typical market noise. Something bigger is usually at play.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, you shared this really detailed NXTT deep stock analysis report. And digging in, what we find is this company with a pretty unique strategy, maybe even a bit weird. They're trying to play in two totally different spaces: AI software, the SaaS model, and just holding Bitcoin.
That's right. That's what their official filings lay out, this sort of dual approach. And figuring out how those two parts connect, or maybe how they don't connect, that's really key to understanding NXTT.
Right. So our job today, our mission is pretty clear. We need to slice through all the hype around this stock, look past those crazy headlines, and really get to the bottom of their actual business. Based on the info we've got, what's the real deal? Is there any actual investment potential here, or maybe not? We're aiming for clarity, trying not to get lost in the weeds.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's about trying to find the fundamental reality of the situation, if there is one in this case.
And honestly, going through this report, some really surprising stuff came up. We're going to look into where their money actually comes from, who's really pulling the strings behind the scenes, and, the kind of risks involved. It's definitely a story with a few twists, so stick around.
Yeah, there are layers here.
By the end, we'll loop back to that crazy volatility and see if it makes more sense. And we'll leave you with something to chew on, a question about spotting real innovation versus just pure speculation these days. And hey, if you find this kind of deep dive helpful, definitely think about subscribing to the Stock Analytics AI YouTube channel. We do this kind of analysis regularly.
Yeah, more deep dives there.
But first things first, let's get into the business itself. What exactly does Next Technology Holding Inc. actually do? And how are they supposedly making money?
Okay, so like you said, two main parts to their stated strategy. First up is this AI-enabled software development, the SaaS model. The analysis shows that for the whole of fiscal year 2024, this brought in, well, only about $1.8 million in revenue.
Just $1.8 million for the whole year. That feels tiny, especially for a company whose market cap briefly shot past $1 billion.
It is remarkably small, yeah. And here's where it gets really interesting, or maybe concerning. In the first quarter of 2025, so the most recent data point we have, that software revenue, it dropped to zero. Absolutely nothing.
Zero, wow.
Which strongly suggests that, that whole side of the business is either struggling badly or they've just basically stopped focusing on it. So the big takeaway here is, despite calling themselves a tech company, NXTT wasn't really making money from software at the start of 2025.
Okay, zero revenue from software. So if that's dried up, what is driving their financials? I guess that takes us to part two, the Bitcoin.
Exactly. The report really hammers this home. Buying and holding Bitcoin has become their main thing, their dominant strategy. They're using cash they have, but also, and this is important, they've been actively raising money by issuing new stock and warrants specifically to buy more Bitcoin.
Ah, okay, so selling shares to buy crypto.
Pretty much.
Cool.
And they treat this Bitcoin as trading assets on their books. That means any change in Bitcoin's price, up or down, flows directly into their net income statement.
And that must explain that huge net income figure we saw in Q1 2025, right? The report mentioned something like $193.4 million.
Correct. That huge reported profit, it's almost entirely because the Bitcoin they hold went up in value during that period. So answering your question about revenue streams right now, the reality is they're making money almost exclusively by betting on Bitcoin's price going up.
Now, this company wasn't always like this, was it? It had a past life. Used to be called WeTrade Group, focused on something called yCloud in China.
Yeah, that's really important background. Historically, they ran this yCloud platform in China. It was aimed at micro-businesses offering cloud services, tech support, billing, using AI and big data, supposedly.
Okay.
But they made a massive change. They shut down their subsidiaries in mainland China back in July 2024. And they shifted their focus, at least for the software side, to the US, Hong Kong, and Singapore.
So they basically ditched their original Chinese business model. That's a huge pivot.
It is. It strongly suggests that original yCloud business is either gone or completely insignificant now.
Got it. Now, I also noticed, looking at their website, they talk about new energy and blockchain tech. They even mention a specific blockchain called F-Chain, a wallet, even ChatGPT services. But the report points out these things don't really show up in their recent SEC filings.
That's a really critical point about, let's say, transparency or maybe the gap between marketing and reality. The website promotes all this cutting-edge stuff, right? But then you look at the official documents they file with the SEC, like their latest 10K annual report from 2024.
Yeah.
And it mostly just talks about that minimal SaaS revenue we mentioned and the Bitcoin strategy.
Correct.
There's really no significant revenue breakdown or operational detail for these other things like New Energy or FT Chain.
So a disconnect.
A big one. It definitely raises questions about whether those other business lines are real or maybe just aspirational or perhaps, just for show.
It really sounds like there's a gap between what they say they do, maybe for promotion, and what the official filings show is actually happening financially. So based on those filings, the main products or services right now are really just that struggling AI SaaS software bit and holding Bitcoin. The rest seems unclear or maybe not really active.
That's a very fair summary based on the financial disclosures, yeah. The filings paint a picture of a company that's basically turned itself into a Bitcoin investment fund that also happens to have this small, sputtering software arm attached.
Okay, let's talk about where they fit in the market. How big a deal is NXTT in these industries they claim to be in?
Well, in software, they're tiny. A really, really minor player. That market is super competitive. You've got giants, you've got tons of smaller, nimble companies. NXTT's revenue figures put them way out on the fringe.
And that market cap has been all over the place, right? The report mentioned it spiking over $1.03 billion after the Bitcoin news, but it was much lower before that.
Exactly. That billion-dollar number was just a temporary peak, really driven by that Bitcoin hype. Before that surge, and probably a better reflection of their actual size, the market cap was hovering around, say, $125 to $135 million.
Okay.
Even more telling, their 2024 annual report actually stated that the market value held by non-affiliates, so not insiders or major holders, was only about $26 million in mid-2024. These huge swings just scream speculation.
They really do. And then there's the employee count, 6 employees, maybe 8 according to one source. For a company that briefly touched $1 billion market cap, that just seems off.
It's highly unusual, yeah. A company valued that high normally needs way more people to run things.
Yeah.
This tiny workforce just reinforces the idea that the recent stock action isn't about some booming underlying business.
Right.
And don't forget that geographic shift moving software efforts from China to the US, Hong Kong, Singapore, that probably tells you something about the challenges they face in their original market.
So drilling down, what's the core value proposition here? Like, why would a customer choose their software? And why would an investor buy the stock?
Okay, on the software side, they claim to offer these AI-enabled SaaS solutions. The website talks about using blockchain for things like supply chain finance, data governance, making things more efficient and transparent, but
the revenue isn't there.
Exactly. The minimal revenue shows that clearly this pitch hasn't really landed with customers in a big way.
Okay, and the Bitcoin strategy, what's the value proposition there?
It's pretty straightforward, really. It gives investors a way to get exposure to Bitcoin's price swings without buying Bitcoin directly. And maybe some see it as an inflation hedge, though that's debatable. By buying NXTT stock, you're essentially betting that Bitcoin's price will go up. The way they account for it as a trading asset really highlights this investment focus.
Okay, so let's try and sum this up. What does NXTT actually do right now, and how are they making money?
The report's conclusion is pretty blunt. NXTT is basically acting as a Bitcoin proxy right now. And this Bitcoin buying spree, it's being funded by selling more and more shares, which waters down the value for everyone already holding the stock.
Just our dilution.
Massive dilution. Meanwhile, the software business looks like it's either failed or just stalled out completely. This whole shift feels less like a smart diversification plan and more like, a desperate move because the original business wasn't working.
Right.
Their future now is almost entirely tied to what happens with the price of Bitcoin. The key thing for you, the listener, to grasp is that NXTT has become a leveraged bet on Bitcoin, paid for by diluting its own shareholders.
That definitely paints a stark picture. Okay, let's zoom out a bit. What about the broader industries, software, Bitcoin, blockchain? Where does NXTT fit or not fit in that landscape?
Well, the software, SaaS, and AI markets. Huge growth potential there, obviously. Digital transformation is still a massive trend. Bitcoin and digital assets, also potential growth, but way more volatile, and the regulatory picture is still pretty murky. Blockchain tech itself has applications beyond just crypto.
But NXTT is mainly focused on the Bitcoin part now.
Overwhelmingly, yes.
Yeah.
Their current involvement is really concentrated in that highly volatile Bitcoin market.
And competition, you said software is tough.
Extremely tough. You've got the big established players, tons of startups fighting for scraps. NXTT is nobody in that world, frankly, and their financial performance in software is weak even compared to other small companies. In the Bitcoin space, they're kind of indirectly competing with other companies holding Bitcoin, like MicroStrategy, and also with easier ways to get Bitcoin exposure, like ETFs.
And regulations seem like a big deal, especially with crypto and their history.
Absolutely. Regulation is a major overhang. Their past in China and current presence in Hong Kong is tricky because crypto rules there are strict and always changing. Moving software focus away from mainland China probably reflects that.
Makes sense.
And then in the US, where they say they're focusing software now, crypto rules are still being figured out, and the SEC is definitely watching closely. Plus, you can't ignore their ongoing problems with NASDAQ not meeting the minimum share price. That's a regulatory risk, too. And those material weaknesses their auditors found in internal controls. That's another red flag.
Wait, material weaknesses. What does that actually mean for investors?
It means their own auditors found significant flaws in their accounting systems and processes. Basically, it makes the financial numbers they report less reliable. You can't be as confident that they're accurate.
Okay, that's serious. And you mentioned the 2025 U.S. tariffs, too.
Yeah, that adds another layer of general economic uncertainty. It might not hit NXTT directly, but it could ripple through the markets, affect crypto prices, and maybe hurt the spending power of potential software clients, if they had any significant ones. And the NASDAQ non-compliance isn't just a technical issue. They could actually get kicked off the exchange, which makes the stock much harder to trade.
So, boiling it down, does this company have any real, sustainable, competitive advantages? Anything that makes them stand out?
The report basically says no. They don't really have any significant lasting edge. Brand recognition is low, especially after changing the name from WeTrade, which had its own baggage.
Right.
There's no sign of cost advantages or scale benefits, given how small they are. Network effects don't really apply. Switching costs for software clients? Probably minimal.
What about the Bitcoin itself, or their claims about special blockchain tech?
Well, holding a lot of Bitcoin is their biggest asset right now, sure, but it's not a unique advantage. Anyone with enough money can buy Bitcoin. As for the proprietary blockchain or AI stuff they talk about on the website, there's just no real proof of that in their revenue or in the detailed SEC filings. The CEO and CFO have relevant experience on paper, yes, but it hasn't translated into any real business success or competitive moat for NXTT so far.
So, back to that basic question. What makes this business hard for someone else to copy?
And the answer, according to this analysis, is not much. The software business, as it stands, seems easily replicable. And the Bitcoin strategy. Anyone with capital can do that. NXTT's method of using dilutive financing isn't some unique advantage, it's just a tactic, and one that really hurts existing shareholders. The key insight for you is that the Bitcoin part is easy to copy, and the software part doesn't seem to be working.
Okay, let's pivot now to the people in charge, the management team. Who's running the show and what's their background?
Well, the current leadership team is pretty new. It's a big change from the folks running things back in the WeTrade Group days. The CEO is Wei-Hong Liu, appointed in January 2024. Her background is studied as crypto investment and research.
Okay.
However, there are reports out there suggesting someone with the same name is actually the billionaire chairwoman of a big Canadian real estate firm, if that's the same person.
Well, it raises big questions about how much time and focus she can actually give to NXTT. Details on her track record outside crypto seem limited.
Yeah, that potential divided attention is definitely a red flag. What about the CFO?
The CFO is Eve Chan. She joined in October 2024. She brings over 15 years in accounting, audit, corporate finance. Her background includes Bitcoin mining experience and property development, too. She's worked at places like X Capital Investment and RHB Investment Bank, dealing with restructuring, compliance stuff. Some sources get confused and call her the CEO, but she's definitely the CFO.
Okay, got it. And we can't just ignore the history, right? The WeTrade Group era sounded pretty messy. Oh, it was definitely messy. WeTrade had a lot of problems. Repeated issues with NASDAQ compliance, admitting to untrue financial reports, questionable spending, lawsuits from shareholders, and they did a massive 1-for-185 reverse stock split back in June 2023. That history casts a long shadow.
Definitely. The report also mentioned that the current team hasn't been there very long. Short tenure.
That's right. The average tenure for the current management and board is really short, like 1.3 or 1.4 years. That kind of turnover can suggest instability. Maybe it's an attempt to make a clean break from the We Trade past.
Maybe.
But here's the thing. Even with the new faces, the company still isn't complying with NASDAQ rules, and they still have those material weaknesses in internal controls we talked about. So just changing people hasn't fixed the fundamental problems.
How has the company dealt with these crises, like the NASDAQ warnings or the bad financial reporting?
Well, with NASDAQ, they've tried things, but they're still not compliant. They recently proposed another reverse stock split as a possible fix. The past financial reporting issues led to investigations and management changes. As for how they're handling the recent crazy stock volatility, there hasn't been much public communication on that yet.
What about transparency? Are they open with investors?
That seems to be a major weak spot. Like we discussed, there's that big gap between the website claims, fancy tech, clean energy mining, and what's actually in the SEC filings, basic SaaS and Bitcoin.
Right.
And the fact that their own auditors flagged material weaknesses and said their disclosure controls aren't effective, that really undermines confidence in anything they put out. Plus, parts of their investor relations website were apparently inaccessible when this report was being researched.
Not a good look. And the company's ethical reputation, given the past and present issues.
It's definitely been tarnished by the We Trade saga. And the current discrepancies between the website and filings, plus those ongoing control weaknesses, just raise more ethical questions about how reliable their information is.
So, putting it all together on management, are they honest, capable, and focused on shareholders?
The analysis raises serious doubts on all three counts. Honesty concerns come from the past reporting issues and the current inconsistencies. Capability is questioned because the team is new, the control problems persist, the software business tanked, and the CEO might have other major commitments.
And shareholder focus.
That seems highly questionable. The way they funded the Bitcoin purchases through massive dilution and the fact that insiders own virtually zero stock. That strongly suggests their interests aren't aligned with regular shareholders. Why would they care about the stock price if they don't own any? The critical insight for you is that a huge chunk of this company is controlled by these mystery entities, which is a massive red flag for smaller investors.
Yeah, not knowing who owns 75% of the company. What kinds of problems could that create for regular investors?
Well, it makes it really hard to hold management accountable, right? And it increases the risk of hidden conflicts of interest. Decisions might be made that benefit those unknown owners, not necessarily all shareholders.
Okay, let's switch gears to financial health. What do the key numbers tell us?
Looking at NXTT's financials, it's clear the picture is totally dominated by Bitcoin now. It makes it really hard to see how the actual business is doing. That market cap, like we said, super volatile, hit $1 billion briefly, but the underlying value seems way lower.
And the PE ratio look weirdly low in some places.
Yeah, but that's completely misleading. It looks low only because those unrealized Bitcoin gains are counted as earnings. It tells you nothing about whether the actual operations are profitable.
Revenue growth was negative, and software revenue basically vanished.
Exactly. Consistent downward trend, and then zero service revenue in Q1 2025. That's a huge warning sign for the operational side.
What about profit margins? They seemed all over the map.
Well, the reporting gross margin looks okay on paper, but it's based on almost no revenue. The operating margin is negative, meaning the core business loses money. The net margin looks fantastic, but again, that's almost entirely the Bitcoin paper gains, not software sales.
Debt to equity looks low, but you mentioned this deferred tax liability. Can you break that down for listeners? What does that mean?
Right, that's important. They don't have much traditional bank debt. True. But because their Bitcoin has gone up so much in value on paper, they've built up this large deferred tax liability. Think of it like an IOU to the tax authorities.
Oh, okay.
They haven't sold the Bitcoin yet, so they haven't paid the tax, but they will owe taxes on those gains eventually when they do sell or if accounting rules change. It's a real future liability hanging over them, potentially requiring a lot of cash down the road.
Gotcha. And free cash flow. Usually a good measure of health.
For NXTT, it's been consistently bad.
Yeah.
Negative or chloro. They're just not generating sustainable cash from running their business.
Price-to-book ratio also seemed inconsistent.
Yeah, because it swings wildly depending on the stock price at any given moment and how much Bitcoin they have recorded on their books at that time.
So, bottom line, is NXTT profitable with a strong balance sheet?
Operationally, no, they're not profitable from their core business. Their net income is driven by volatile Bitcoin gains. And while the balance sheet looks okay because of the Bitcoin value, it's kind of an illusion. They have very little actual cash and this big future tax bill. So their financial stability is shaky and depends heavily on Bitcoin's price staying high or going higher.
Let's dig a bit more into that stability. What about earnings consistency?
Extremely inconsistent. Wild swings over the last 5 years, mostly losses from operations, with net income skewed massively by non-operational stuff, especially the recent Bitcoin gains.
And dividends. Any cash back to shareholders?
Nope, NXTT doesn't pay any dividends.
Debt management seems okay apart from that looming tax liability.
Right. Minimal traditional debt. But that deferred tax liability from the Bitcoin gains is the key thing to watch. It's grown significantly and represents a big future cash outflow they'll need to fund somehow.
What about working capital? Any clues there about short-term health?
Well, the standard ratios, like the current ratio, look super high, but that's distorted because they count Bitcoin as a current asset. The quick ratio is similar. But the cash ratio, that's actually very low. Meaning they don't have much readily available cash. They're relying on being able to sell that Bitcoin quickly if they need cash for short-term bills. That's a liquidity risk, especially combined with that big future tax payment. Their turnover ratios also just reflect how little actual business they're doing.
So, summing up financial stability, volatile earnings, not much traditional debt.
Exactly. Earnings are incredibly volatile, driven by Bitcoin, no excessive traditional debt.
Right.
But overall stability is precarious because they're banking everything on a volatile asset, have little cash, and face that significant deferred tax liability.
All right, moving into the second half of our deep dive, let's talk market sentiment. How is the market actually viewing NXTT stock right now?
The overwhelming view seems to be speculative and extremely volatile. It's all tied to the Bitcoin holdings and those reported gains. The stock just screams high risk, massive price swings, the NASDAQ compliance issues, the messy history, the China-Hong Kong risks.
Yeah.
Short-term technical charts showed buy signals after the huge pop, but also signs it was overbought. Suggests it's mostly traders with a very high-risk tolerance playing here. Before the Bitcoin news really hit, its momentum rating was actually very weak.
So sentiment is probably split.
Probably sharply divided, yeah. You've got crypto enthusiasts maybe excited about the Bitcoin angle, and then fundamental investors likely staying far, far away. It feels like trading is driven by the Bitcoin narrative, not any real intrinsic value calculation.
Analyst coverage seems pretty thin on the ground.
It is. Basically, no traditional Wall Street analysts cover it, which isn't surprising for a microcap stock behaving like this. TipRanks apparently flagged it as overvalued, but without much detail.
How have recent news events really moved the needle?
The biggest driver, hands down, was the news about them buying more Bitcoin and that Q1 earnings report showing the massive paper gains. That's what lit the fuse on that huge price surge in May 2025. It basically cemented the market's view of NXTT as just a Bitcoin proxy.
Right.
The ongoing NASDAQ non-compliance, that's negative for fundamental folks, but the Bitcoin hype seems to have drowned that out for speculators. And the broader uncertainty from the 2025 U.S. tariffs, that could indirectly dampen things by adding to market volatility, maybe hitting crypto prices or speculative appetite generally.
What about short interest? Sometimes that tells a story.
It's weird here. The official reported short interest is tiny, almost nothing. But the cost to borrow shares to short them is apparently very high, and there have been times recently when no shares were available to borrow.
So demand to short, but hard to actually do it.
Seems like it. Could be demand, but maybe it's just too risky or difficult given the volatility. The huge price jump looks like it was driven by buying pressure, not a short squeeze, based on this data. And unfortunately, the report didn't have any info on options trading.
And the impact of those 2025 U.S. tariffs again, just indirect.
Most likely indirect, yeah. Since their software business is minimal and they've shifted away from mainland China operations, the tariffs probably don't hit them directly. The main risk is just broader market chaos affecting crypto prices, which is now their main asset.
Okay, let's shift to who actually owns this company. What's the ownership structure look like?
Institutional ownership, meaning big funds, mutual funds, pensions, is incredibly low, like less than 1%. That usually signals a real lack of confidence from professional money managers. And several funds that did hold small stakes recently sold out.
Wow. And insiders, management and directors.
Virtually zero. The official filings say 0% insider ownership. That's almost unheard of for a public company.
What does that signal to you?
It signals a major potential disconnect. Management has no skin in the game. Their financial interests aren't aligned with shareholders through stock ownership.
That is striking. What about ownership concentration? You mentioned a big shift.
Yeah, a huge shift happened after that financing deal in March 2025, where they issued tons of shares and warrants to buy Bitcoin. Suddenly, 8 different entities, all registered in the British Virgin Islands, BVI, popped up as major shareholders.
EVI entities.
Yep, and together, these 8 BVI firms now control roughly 75% of the entire company.
75% controlled by BVI entities. That sounds opaque. Do we know who's behind them? Who are the ultimate owners?
That's the million-dollar question, or maybe billion-dollar, given the peak market cap. The report specifically says the ultimate beneficial owners of these BVI entities are not identified in the filings.
Wow.
So you have this incredibly opaque control structure. We literally don't know who holds the vast majority of the voting power. That's a massive governance risk for any minority shareholder.
Yeah, not knowing who owns 3/4 of the company. What kind of problems can that create for regular investors like our listeners?
Well, like we touched on, it makes it super hard to hold management accountable. Who are they really answerable to? And it dramatically increases the risk of hidden conflicts of interest or self-dealing. Decisions could be made to benefit these unknown owners at the expense of everyone else.
That lack of transparency is deeply concerning. What does this all mean for corporate governance overall?
The implications are pretty bad. You've got this opaque control limiting public shareholder influence. You have almost no institutional oversight and zero insider ownership acting as checks. You have those reported material weaknesses showing controls are flawed. You have the dilutive financing suggesting minority shareholders aren't the priority.
Right.
Even the independent directors on the board.
Mm.
You have to question their effectiveness given that these problems persist and they approve the dilution. It really paints a picture of a high-risk governance situation lacking transparency, weak controls, and interests likely not aligned with public investors.
Okay, let's try to pull all the risks together. The report used a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats.
Right. So strengths, mainly the big pile of Bitcoin they hold. Also low traditional debt. And historically, they did have positive gross margins on software, even if revenue was tiny.
And the weaknesses. Sounds like a longer list.
It is. Weaknesses include basically no real operating business left, extreme dependency on Bitcoin's price,
Yeah.
a poor track record and credibility issues from the past, those material weaknesses and controls, very little cash, a new, largely unproven management team, massive shareholder dilution, and that total lack of insider ownership.
Opportunities seem mostly tied to Bitcoin, too.
Pretty much. The main opportunities are Bitcoin price going up, maybe tapping into the growing ISAs market, though they haven't shown they can, possibly leveraging their claimed blockchain AI skills if they're real, and maybe, just maybe, getting back into compliance with NASDAQ.
And the threats seem pretty serious.
They are significant, yes. Threats include Bitcoin price crashing, regulatory crackdowns on crypto, specific regulatory risks in China, Hong Kong, or with their holding structure, getting delisted from NASDAQ entirely, the new team failing to execute, major governance risks from that opaque ownership, running out of cash, liquidity risks, indirect hits from U.S. tariffs affecting markets, intense software competition, and frankly, the risk of misrepresentation or even fraud, given the gaps we've seen.
It's striking that the main strength Bitcoin is also the biggest weakness and threat.
Absolutely. It cuts both ways massively. The analysis really stresses the deep operational weaknesses and the sheer number and severity of the threats. Market volatility, regulation, governance, delisting. These seem much more likely impactful than the limited opportunities. And that risk of misrepresentation. It feels higher here than usual because of the website versus filings disconnect, the history, the weak controls. It raises questions about the integrity of the information itself.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what's the final verdict on Next Technology Holding Inc.?
Well, putting it all together, you have a company with a negligible software business that's gone all in on a highly leveraged Bitcoin bet, funded by diluting shareholders. You have serious questions about transparency and management integrity, major governance risks due to opaque ownership and weak controls, financials that are totally volatile and dependent on Bitcoin's unpredictable price, and market sentiment that looks purely speculative and detached from fundamentals, plus numerous significant risks hanging over it.
And if we look at this through a value investing lens, like Warren Buffett might, how does NXTT stack up?
It fails pretty much every test. Is the business simple and understandable? Nope. Complex Bitcoin play, opaque owners, regulatory fog, favorable long-term prospects. Doesn't look like it failed software, future riding solely on Bitcoin speculation, management able and trustworthy. Highly questionable past issues, lack of transparency, control failures, dilution, zero insider ownership.
And the final test, Attractive price, margin of safety.
Definitely not. Intrinsic value is almost impossible to calculate reasonably. The market cap seems completely disconnected from any tangible asset value, especially considering the low cash and deferred tax liability. There's absolutely no margin of safety here. A discounted cash flow analysis probably comes out negative given the lack of operational profit.
So, based on everything we've dug into, the final recommendation is
A strong avoid. This is an extremely high-risk, speculative play. It's completely unsuitable for value investors. That recent crazy price surge looks totally unsustainable based on the company's actual condition and the mountain of risks it faces.
Well, that certainly brings us back to where we started, that extreme volatility in NXTT's stock. It really seems like that wasn't just random noise, was it? It feels like a direct symptom of everything we've uncovered. This highly speculative situation, loaded with underlying risks, built on a foundation that seems pretty shaky beyond just the price of Bitcoin.
That's exactly the takeaway, I think. The wild swings directly reflect the speculation and the inherent instability when a company becomes so dependent on one unpredictable thing.
And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? In this age of super fast tech change, how do we as investors tell the difference between real groundbreaking innovation and these kinds of, well, speculative asset plays? And what happens long term if we focus too much on the latter? It's a crucial question for anyone trying to navigate the markets today.
It really is a fundamental challenge for thoughtful investing right now.
If you found this detailed breakdown useful and want more critical looks at market trends and specific companies, definitely subscribe to the Stock Analytics AI YouTube channel.
Yeah, we try to provide this kind of objective, in-depth analysis to help you cut through the noise.
And just the usual disclaimer, this analysis is based on public information available as of May 12th, 2025. AI helps synthesize the info for this deep dive, but the conclusions and opinions are our interpretation of that source material. Always, always do your own thorough research before making any investment decisions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.